My name is Jacob Evans, and this is my story. I was born in Martinsburg, West Virginia, which is about 2 hours away from Baltimore, about an hour and a half away from Washington, D.C. I was born to two parents. My dad was a family practitioner, dentist, and my mom was a presidential appointee. If you don't know what that means that there's cabinet members who are directly underneath the president, and then there's presidential appointees that are directly underneath of those cabinet members. So I have two really high-performing parents, and I'm one of two. I'm the oldest, and so when I was growing up, it was almost expected that I perform highly as well. And for the most part, I always rose to the occasion. Yeah, to a degree. There was definitely a little bit of rebellion that took place for a little while whenever I was younger, but I feel like that was kind of normal. Where I feel as though I was different from other people was that from a super young age, I always had a difficult time connecting. What I mean by that is that I had a couple of good friends, but even they didn't necessarily know everything that was going on with me. I remember this even whenever I was young. And I had more interactions by myself and had more fun playing by myself than what I did with other people. So that's one thing that I kind of, when I look back on it now, I noticed it was a little bit different about the way that my mind operated whenever I was younger from other people. So I'm in elementary school in Martinsburg, West Virginia. I always performed highly whenever it came to grades and academics, but when it came to these social interactions, I was having a really difficult time and I wanted attention on me. Like I said, both my parents were professionals, so a lot of their time was spent just developing themselves and becoming better people. So it was really, really tough for me whenever I would come home and they wouldn't necessarily always be there or be present, especially in the earlier days. So the older that I got, the more that I strove for this attention. And I did it in the wrong ways, to be completely honest. Like, what would wind up happening would be that I would get in trouble at school, which would then cause a conversation to take place between my parents and myself. And this trouble would always stem from me wanting to have all eyes on me. So what ended up happening was I got kicked out of public school. And then I wound up going into private school, and this private school was a Catholic school. And so while I'm there, I'm trying to reconcile the way that I feel about just authority in general, along with managing like a high-performing academic career, along with trying to figure out how I fit socially, because although in public school, like the pool was a lot bigger, now it's a lot smaller. So it's a lot more noticeable whenever you don't necessarily have as many friends. And so I just took on that role of like being the person who wanted to be seen. And some of it was genuine, but I remember being in religion class and asking a specific question regarding why there were quotation marks in the Bible. And rather than being explained, the answer was one, taken from me. It wasn't given an answer, and two, I was kicked out of religion class. And so that further compounded this negativity towards authority, where I feel like in most places, other than West Virginia, this thing would have been looked at as an opportunity to disciple or an opportunity to educate somebody. A student who's challenging and asking these questions would most times be viewed as somebody who was outside of the box in a really positive way. And if you can rein that in and turn it into a positive skill set, this individual would probably wind up being really, really successful. But a lot of times, because West Virginia is a little bit behind in certain things, it was stifled. And when I look back on this, I noticed it a lot with more people than just me. I noticed it a lot with people all along West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Ohio. Like, if you don't fit within the standard template box, then you are ineffectively like challenged or in some shape and way and form like you're wrong or you're not normal. And I decided to take that on, and I began running with that mentality or that narrative that I was different. And so you fast forward and I get into high school, and the only thing that's keeping me out of my own head and telling myself these negative things like I'm different, I don't fit in with other people, I won't ever fit in with other people, is keeping myself out of my head by participating in extracurriculars. So I'd always played football. I played varsity football while I was in high school. I was in jazz band. I played guitar. I was in show choir. I was on an academic team. I was performing exceptionally well in terms of academics. I was trying my best to be as involved as what I could with school. I had my own band outside where I wrote my own music and performed live shows. And that's honestly where this kind of starts and where my addiction story really truly begins in terms of substance. The mentality, the mindset, the longing to connect, that was all pre-existent. But where the substances start was whenever I was exposed to things like weed or alcohol, whenever I was like roughly 14 years old, and I was playing shows with people that were 18, 19, 20 plus, and I saw people doing this stuff all the time. And so I was exposed to it, and finally I decided to do it. And for the first time ever, almost as though it was communion, I was connecting with people. And although it was over a drug, it was what I had been looking for a long time. And it instantaneously gave me something that I had in common with other people. Like, yeah, I was involved in show choir and jazz band and music and all this stuff, but I didn't really feel like I was a part of until somebody was asking me, hey, do you want to match? Hey, do you want to do this? And then I felt wanted or appreciated. And so this continued throughout high school. I feel as though for the most part it was pretty normal. I smoked here and there, I drank on the weekends, I did things that I thought every other teenager was doing, but the difference was that I was doing it for the wrong reasons. And I was doing it for deep-rooted reasons. I was doing it because I didn't feel like I belonged, and this was the only way that I felt like I was ever going to. And so most of my relationships were built around the idea of using substances. So you fast forward throughout towards the end of high school, and my dad, like I said before, he was a dentist, and there was this program that was available to exiting high school seniors called Dent Step or Farm Step or Med Step. And basically what that means is that you're pre-accepted into dental school, pharmacy school, or medical school, leaving high school, and you have a guaranteed spot. And so I applied to this program. There were over 1,500 applicants, and they only accepted 3 of us, and I was one of those 3 that were accepted. So I'm pre-accepted into dental school, and I felt as though like my entire life I've been being groomed for this position. And my dad just looks over at me and he's like, I'm proud of you, but don't mess it up. And so, I'm looking for these attaboys, I'm looking for these achievements, these accomplishments that are gonna result in me having self-worth in myself. And it's met with appreciation, of course, but also this contingency on it. And so at that moment, I completely repelled against it. And I remember telling myself, your dad grew up less than a mile away from where his home is now. He went to school, he came back, he married his high school sweetheart, and he now lives in the same town he grew up in. His office is less than a mile away. Do you want that life for yourself? And my answer was no. And I didn't have the heart to tell him myself. So as I was entering into my first year in college, my band was starting to pick up some speed. We were playing locally up and down the Baltimore area. My best friend for a long time played drums, I played guitar. We were playing with like an all-star group out of the Winchester, Martinsburg area. And so I decided I was going to give up going to school and being a dentist, and I wasn't going to tell my parents about it. I was just going to give it up and pursue music full time. And what wound up happening as a result of that was that I was exposed to things like cocaine, LSD, ecstasy, and a lot of those substances. I didn't do them until I was 19, but I'm surely made up for it in the lack of time that I didn't do it. And so it became a drug-fueled, drug-binged year for me. And what wound up happening there was that my band ultimately wound up breaking up. I was working in this recording studio, getting my recording engineering certification, and I just remember looking around me and seeing that these people that were working in this recording studio were pretty much trapped in the time that they came in. Like there were guys that were wearing jeans that had holes in their legs, they had long hair, but they were balding on top, or they were wearing like flannel t-shirts with band tees. I was like, these guys are stuck in the 90s. And do I want to be the person that I am today for the rest of my life? And the answer again was no, so I decided I needed to go back to school. Now, what's really interesting is the fact that I always had this self-awareness that I needed to grow, but I didn't ever have the self-awareness enough to know that like I needed to grow personally. I just thought it was, in achievement or in these accolades. So my self-worth was directly proportional to whatever I could achieve. So when I went back to school, I was like, I'm going to get a 4.0. I'm going to get so involved that everybody knows who I am. So I sat out and I joined a fraternity and became academic chair. I wound up becoming a student governor, which basically means I was on a legislative body for student government, and I got the highest votes that were ever given to a student governor at that point. I wound up doing National Model United Nations. It was highly decorated. I was Dean's List multiple times over. I was doing what I had set out to do, is that I wanted to get so involved and I wanted people to know who I was. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to feel connected is really what it came down to again, because I didn't feel connected to me. So again, I tackle on all these extracurriculars. And on top of this, while I'm going to school full time, I'm also managing a suit store. So I'm taking on all of this stuff in order to avoid what's really going on upstairs. That every time that I achieve something, whether it's a position or a promotion or having a specific girl or like whatever it was, every time that I had accomplished something, I still felt just as crappy on the inside. I kept telling myself, like, once you get here, then you'll be happy. Once this happens, then you'll be happy. But I never was. For me, it took me a long time to realize that it wasn't just the accomplishments. I thought that it was, so for towards the end of my college career, I was like, I'm going to go into law school. And I didn't know why. It's not like I had this true passion for the law. It's just that, I felt like that's what I needed to do next. So I applied, and in order to lessen the cost, I was like, I'm going to be student body vice president. And so I ran for that, and I got both of those things at the same time. And again, I wasn't any happier. And around this time, I was really starting to question, like, why, like, what is wrong with me? I have all these things going on for me, but yet none of it really fills me. I'm not feeling fulfilled. And I couldn't figure it out, and I wound up having my first ever panic attack, believing that, I was dying, and that I was having a heart attack, and I wound up calling an ambulance and going into the emergency room, and I wasn't using any substances at the time, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. Then there was this trip for National Model United Nations in New York, and on this trip I met this one individual. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He passed away. What wound up happening was that I was exposed to Percocet 30s for the first time, or opiates. It's just a different form of opiate. And I saw these things, and he asked me if I wanted to try one, and as though I was some sort of pedestal drug addict, I said, yeah, no, I only put cocaine up my nose if it's going to be anything. And then he looked at me and he said, well, you could smoke these. And for me, somebody who my introduction to substances was smoking weed, like I was like, oh, okay, so I can smoke these things. Show me how. And so he showed me how you put the pill into the foil, you put the lighter underneath of it, and you just hit it the way that that's how you do it. And so when I saw him do it, I was like, let me see it. And I did it myself, and within a second, all of that self-doubt, all of that longing to connect, all of that not really understanding who I was, it didn't matter anymore. I didn't care. And for the first time ever, I took a huge deep breath and I felt at peace. And I can say that looking back on it, all I knew was that I felt really, really, really good. But I know looking back on it, that's what it did for me. Is that everything since I was a child, everything that I had ever felt like I wanted to have in life, that it was just out of my grasp, my reach, that drug gave to me in a fraction of a second. I continued to do it the rest of that trip, and I actually performed better. I felt like my speeches were better. I felt like I had more energy. It's because I wasn't feeling weighed down by all these emotions, by all this negative self-talk that was going on in my head 24/7. As we were coming back from that trip, I'm used to working like 13-hour days, like being really, really, really tired, especially on these trips, and something was different. I didn't feel right. And I don't mean like I felt different. I mean like I felt like really sick. And I remember getting off the bus, that gentleman looked me in the eyes and he was like, "Hey man, if you ever need any more of those, all I gotta do is call." And I thought to myself, yeah right, I'm probably never gonna use these things again. And I got into my car and I drove home. And I talked to my little sister and I told her how I was feeling, and she looks at me and she goes, "It sounds like you're addicted to opiates." And I looked up addiction symptoms, and sure enough I was. And I knew that I was about to have to go and work a shift, and then I was gonna have to go back to school and do all these things. Like, there's no way I can feel like this. I have way too much on my plate to be feeling like this for any period of time. And what I was reading was saying it was gonna last 2, 3, 4 days. Sometimes post-acute withdrawal symptoms could last weeks. And so I was freaking out. I was like, there's no way I can feel like this. So what did I do? I called that guy. It only took me 4 days to become addicted to opiates, physically addicted. The mental addiction was even worse for me. It continued every single day for roughly about 1.5 years. I felt like I was managing it for a little while. I was still making top marks in my law school classes. I was still performing well in terms of being student body vice president. I was still maintaining some resemblance of relationships with my family, all the way up until the summer. And when that summer hit, my using skyrocketed. I was no longer a student body vice president. I didn't have school in session. The only thing I needed to worry about was how I was going to get well and getting well. So my whole life started revolving around using. And my using went way up over that summer. As I went into my second year into law school, I couldn't even sit through a whole 45-minute class without having to get up and go use the bathroom so I could use. I was showing up late so that I could use, make sure that I had my drugs. I was becoming more irritable. My best friend, who was in law school with me, I lived right next door to him. I hadn't seen him in over a month. Things were slipping for me, and beyond all else, what really wound up happening was that the internal dialogue was back, and it was worse. I was no longer looking at myself and saying, what's wrong with me? Why can't I connect? I have all these amazing things going on. I was looking at myself and saying, what's wrong with me? I'm destroying everything that I touch. And I want to stop, but I can't. And I've tried, but I've failed. And for somebody who was always successful at everything he ever did, that was the most humbling thing to ever happen to me, was to try and fail on my own. And try again and fail again. No matter what I did, I couldn't do it. So I decided I just needed to keep using. And if I just kept this going, then eventually God will provide me a way out. See, I didn't want to take responsibility for anything that was happening to me. I wanted it done for me. And so I remember at this point in time, I think I was using about 8 30-milligram Percocet a day, smoking them. And I remember showing up to a cyber law class, and I wasn't even supposed to be in cyber law. I thought it was what my mom specialized in, cybersecurity. It turns out it was actually copyright law for online copyright. I don't know why, but I decided to stay in that class. And I had every intention of dropping it, but I was sitting in that class about a month into my second year, and I just get a little sticky note on my desk. And it says, "Jake, I need to talk to you after class." And so I look up at the teacher, who I have no connection with, barely ever spoken to her, and I just give her a thumbs up, like really unassuredly. And she shakes her head, and so class goes through, and I get up and I walk over to her and I ask her, what's going on? She goes, "I want to show you something." She pulls out this sheet of paper. She sets it down. And she starts going through dates. She goes, late, 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 on time, late, 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 on time, late, 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 on time. And she just looks up at me, and I don't know if it was the way that she looked at me. I don't know if it was her presence and what I felt in the moment. I don't know what all it was, but she looked at me. She's like, I feel like something's going on. There are times whenever you understand nuances in the law that even I don't get. You're incredibly intelligent, but you're on the borderline of failing this class and not being able to take your exam, not because you haven't scored high enough on any other exam, because you can't show up on time. You're like, it doesn't make sense. You're one of the highest scorers, but yet you can't show up on time. Like, are you okay? Are you okay? And it took me back. I didn't know what to say. For the first time ever in my life, I was at a loss of words. And I saw two very distinct paths point themselves out for me. I could pull myself up by my bootstraps and do what I had always done, just escape through, make sure that I was going to be okay and succeed, all the while trying to manage this addiction, and eventually it was going to catch up to me. Or I could take the hand that was being extended. And I remember saying, like, God will help me and he will provide me a way. And so I remember that hitting me and me deciding, this is probably that way. So I told her everything. The first time I had ever openly admitted to using any sort of substances to any sort of authority figure. And I vented it all out. And after I was finished, it's not like I felt better, but I knew it couldn't get any worse than that at this point. And so I was finished, and I just look at her and I was like, so what now? She goes, well, now we have to go tell the dean and set up a plan for you to be able to succeed and get healthy. And so I didn't know what that meant, so I went with her, and then I told the dean the same story. And I felt a little bit better again. I couldn't describe it. I wouldn't say it was like a weight off of my chest, but it didn't have as much power over me. And so the more that I continued to say this stuff, and the more that I let them know about what was going on with me, and the positive reaction, the supporting, the rallying around me, saying, let's get you healthy. Don't come back until you're healthy. Let's figure out a way to make this work. Give me a little bit of hope. And every time I told my story to somebody else, whether it was the teacher or the dean, I felt a little bit better. I wouldn't say it was like a weight coming off of my chest, but it didn't have as much power over me. And I can remember my mom came up for a football game 2 days later, and I sat her down in this chair in a hotel room, and I grabbed her by her knees and I looked at her in the eyes. And to her, this was a huge surprise. Like, her son was in law school, he was student body vice president, he was doing all these things. On paper, it looked like I had my stuff together. And I looked at her and I said, I'm struggling. I have an addiction and I need help. And it wasn't 2 hours before we were in a car heading back to Martinsburg. And in the back of my head, my parents and neither of us knew what it was that I needed to do. We had never been through this before. But I knew at-home detoxes didn't work. I had tried it before. But I was willing to give it a shot because I wasn't doing it alone. My parents had the best of intentions, but they just simply weren't educated, and we didn't know how to do this thing. It wasn't 2 days later I was using in my parents' house. And I remember about 4 or 5 days later, my dad came to me. He knew that I was using. And he goes, Jake, we can't help you. We need to turn it over to somebody who knows how to help you. Here's a list of numbers. Call one of them. And we didn't know what we were doing. We just looked up rehab on Google, and my dad got a couple of numbers and handed them over to me. So I made a call, and it's interesting because the very first time I went into this 30-day treatment facility, rather than like trying to seek help, the same thing that had kept me sick for so long since I was a child was resurfacing now whenever I was in a healing place. And I looked around me, and I wasn't looking for things that made me similar, that connected me to these people. I was looking for the things that made me different. I looked at the guy who was beside me in my room and I was like, this guy's died 6 times and come back to life. This other dude's been to prison multiple times. This person over here beats their wife. I'm not like these people. Am I really this bad? Is this where I'm supposed to be? And I looked for everything that made me different. And I even went to the extent of sitting across from my therapist and looking them in the eyes and asking them, like, are you sober? And how can you possibly give me advice on what I need to do for the rest of my life if the only thing you've ever done was read it in a book? And so everything that I was hearing in there for the last 30 days, I just dismissed it. They didn't know what they were talking about. I knew what I needed. And about halfway through that process, I convinced myself that I could use opiates again. You see, it's an interesting thing what happens to the brain whenever you're using opiates. The part of your brain that's responsible for connection, opiates latch right onto that. And all of a sudden that desire, that longing that we as humans look for to connect to other human beings, it's gone because opiates have taken its place. And when you remove the opiates from the equation, that longing is still there, but nothing can give it to you the way that opiates did. Or so you think. So I was already looking for ways to bring opiates back into my life, my best friends back into my new life. I was going to manage it this time. It was going to be different because I didn't have the same physical addiction that I had before. I could just use it here and there. When I left that 30-day treatment facility, it was less than an hour before I drank alcohol. I told myself at the airport, my problem isn't alcohol, I can drink a beer. And I did. And it wasn't even a full 24 hours before I had started using again. I remember on the 3rd day of using again, telling myself, waking up and saying, you're not sick right now, you can stop. If you use today, you're going to have to ride this thing all the way out. Just like they said at that 30-day treatment facility, you're going to have to go through this thing again. If you're lucky, you will. And I used anyway. It lasted for about 2 months. And at the peak of that particular run, I quadrupled my intake and I was using 24 30 milligram Percocet every day, about $1,000 a day habit. I can remember on the 10th day going to the same branch bank, and I come from a small town, anybody who's familiar with Martinsburg, and so I remember thinking to myself, like, maybe I shouldn't go to the same branch again. But then I got a text from my drug dealer saying, hey, I'm less than 5 minutes away from that bank. So I went there. And it wasn't 10 minutes from the time I had the drugs in my pocket that I got a phone call from my mom saying, you need to get home now. No other explanation. And I knew what that meant. It meant she knew what was happening. And so from the time I received that phone call until the time I walked through the door, it was about 2.5 hours. And as soon as I hit the door, I was handed a urinalysis cup and told, go use the bathroom. I said I couldn't, and so they locked me inside of a closet until I was going to be okay to use the bathroom. And even in that closet, with drugs in my pocket, I'm sitting there thinking of ways that I can try to fake this test. And I sat in there for about 30 minutes. Until my dad came home and he told me, he looks at me and he goes, Jake, you need to take that test. So I did. And of course I failed. And he sat down across the kitchen table from me and looked at me and said, I don't care where you go, but you can't be here. You can be homeless out on the streets here. I'll get you a one-way ticket somewhere. You can go be homeless there, but you will not use in this house and you will not stay here because this is not working. And I looked at them and I said, well, what do I do? They said, make a phone call. And so now completely humbled, completely shamed, I called that same 30-day facility back, the same place where I had dismissed everything that I had heard, and I said, can I please come back? And I had governmental insurance through my mom's job, so of course they were willing to take me back. And it's truly a shame what happens at some treatment facilities where it's a revolving door. They said, we can get you on a plane at 7:30 tonight, or we can get you on a plane at first thing in the morning. My mom said, you can make that flight tonight. And the airport's about an hour and a half away from where we live, and it was almost 4 o'clock, and so I had to pack quick, and so I packed one bag and I had my drugs in my pocket, and I was thinking of a way to get these pills through airport security, and I did. And when I realized that I was finally willing to take responsibility for me being somebody who suffers from substance abuse, was whenever I was sitting in an airplane bathroom on that second plane because I had a layover, and I was ducked down and I was waving smoke off the pills and off the foil away from the smoke detector, and I was like, if I get in trouble right now in US federal airspace, I'm going away for a long time. I have a problem. It didn't stop me from using the rest of the pills that I had, but it did change my mindset going into that place, and I decided it didn't matter what it was. If I had to hop on one foot for an hour, rub my stomach and pat my head out, and they told me to do it for 1 hour, I was going to do it for 2, because I was serious this time. I really wanted to get it right. I was tired of getting it wrong. I was tired of letting this thing rule me. And so when I went in there that time, I said, I don't care what it is I have to do. I'm here to follow direction. And I said, you need to find a long-term treatment facility. 30 days isn't going to cut it for you. And so I found this place called Treehouse Recovery, and it's in Costa Mesa, California. They don't use medications or things like that. Like, what wound up happening is there was a huge focus on the connection aspect of addiction. You see, addiction is supposed to be treated in a biological, psychological, and sociological level. A lot of places miss that sociological component, but Treehouse puts an emphasis on it. In order to treat the biology, they don't give you medications. They ask you to participate in physical activity. And that physical activity is going to help produce things like dopamine. That's going to help with depression. It's going to produce serotonin because you're doing it in a group setting, and that's going to help mitigate your anxiety. It's going to help produce and regulate GABA, which is going to increase your emotional threshold or your emotional resiliency. And what wound up happening is that you're doing all of this with a team, so you're connecting. The thing that I've been looking for my entire life, I got in a treatment center. And I learned how to make deep bonded connections. I learned how to talk about what was going on with me. I learned how to identify what was going on with me. And I learned how to not let what is going on with me affect everything else in my life. That was almost 5 years ago now. Today I'm a father. I'm a husband. I've helped hundreds of people navigate the beginning stages of looking for help for substance abuse. I'm an admissions counselor and a certified drug and alcohol counselor for Treehouse Recovery. I'm a peer recovery coach, a professional success coach, and a motivational speaker. Not too long ago, I went back to that same university that I was running rampant and using, and I gave speeches to students and to faculty and to staff and told them exactly what was going on with me. Here's what happened to me. We are in the age of connection versus pseudo-connection. We're arguably the most connected that we've ever been, but we don't know how to connect with each other. I can speak to somebody across the world right now in a fraction of a second. But before, I didn't know how to tell my best friend what was happening with me. So I talk about connection, then I talk about why the connection piece is directly correlating to the opioid epidemic. And then I let them know how one conversation saved my life. How one person being available to actually hear the answer of those 3 words, are you okay? How that changed my life forever. And how anyone, you don't have to be a peer recovery coach or an admissions counselor or be trained in all the things that I am to help save somebody. That teacher wasn't. She just cared. And she didn't even have to care, but she did. And it saved my life. 6 months after me getting sober, I received a phone call that the guy who introduced me to opiates had passed away from a heroin overdose alone in his apartment on Thanksgiving Day. It could have been me, but it wasn't. And in that moment, I decided that I'm going to do everything I can to help families navigate through this, because my family didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to handle it. But I know now. and I help other people through it every single day. So if you want to learn more information about me, about my coaching practice, about treehouse recovery, about anything, if you just want someone to talk to, please, you can reach out to me. My email is jacob.e@hopeguides.com. I would love to hear from you, because I truly believe that every single person can save a life. I'm grateful that you took the time to watch this video, and I really look forward to connecting with you soon. Again, my name is Jacob Evans. I used to be an opioid addict, but now I'm a father, a husband, an admissions counselor, peer recovery coach, a professional success coach, motivational speaker, and above all else, a friend.